Thank you very much. Mr. Helmer.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and can I extend my thanks too to our rapporteur, who made the objectives of this measure very clear. And it was very clear from what he said that the primary motivator here is the European dream and the centralisation of decision-making on energy and control over European energy rather than the efficiency of the grid and of electricity supply. Of course, there are efficiencies to be gained by cross-border cooperation between member states, but that should be driven by the member states themselves and their perceived advantage from those projects and not decided centrally in Brussels and imposed upon 27 member states. Now, our rapporteur says we must not allow distortions in the market. I agree with you, sir. But do you not appreciate that the whole of European energy policy is about imposing distortions on the market? We have chosen to bias the market against fossil fuels and in favour of low-carbon energy based on science which is increasingly doubtful and questionable. Even within the area of low-carbon energy, we have chosen to bias our activity in favour of what we call renewables and against nuclear. I can see no rational reason for doing that. The whole of European energy policy, as I say, is all about creating distortions. So while I agree with your aspiration that we should avoid distortions, this committee and the policies of the European Union are precisely about creating distortions. You mentioned your concern about the price of gas. I wonder if you have noticed that in America the price of gas has virtually halved as the American economy pursues new sources of gas and that we in Europe are failing to pursue that with the energy and vigour which we ought to do. We could bring down the price of gas, we could make ourselves less dependent on imports. We hear very little about that in this committee. Finally, I wrote down one of your phrases which I particularly appreciated, the right of consumers to efficient and affordable energy. I agree with you. I would love to see European consumers with access to efficient and affordable energy, but you simply cannot do that by promoting very high-cost, intermittent, unreliable sources of energy like wind and solar. So as usual in the European Union, as usual in this Parliament, as usual in this committee, we express wonderful aspirations and we then put in place policies which run in the face of those aspirations and make them simply unachievable. So I will certainly be opposing this measure. Thank you very much.
Mr. Helmer is last.
And may I agree with Mr. Weber in supporting nuclear energy. It is absolutely essential to our future energy mix. Can I just regret, though, that every time we mention nuclear we make apologetic noises about safety. I do wish colleagues would go away and look at the statistics for mortality in the hydro industry and the coal industry, and they would find that not only is the nuclear industry safer than hydro or coal, it is safer by several orders of magnitude. It is enormously safer. Okay, I really wanted to challenge some remarks, though, from Mrs. Hall, where she said, and I wrote it down, energy from renewables is much more secure than imported energy. Unfortunately, renewables are unpredictable and intermittent, and therefore they cannot be described as secure by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I think partly Mrs. Hall recognises this. She referred to hydro, and of course hydro can be used. You can pump water uphill and you can recover energy, so you can store energy with hydro facilities. It's rather inefficient, but you can do it. The trouble is we don't have in Europe anything like enough hydro capacity to store the energy from all the renewables we propose to put in place. So it's a small part of the solution, but only a small part. She says buying and selling between countries will help. Well, perhaps, Mrs. Hall, you haven't noticed that when it's dark in Scandinavia, it's quite frequently dark in Italy as well. The sun tends to go away from the whole of Europe at the same time. And in the case of wind, it is not true, as the Greens tell us, that the wind is always blowing somewhere. It is perfectly possible, and frequently happens, that there are very large areas of Europe covered by high-pressure zones with very low wind, so you can lose both wind and solar, you need backup. Mrs. Hall recognises this and she refers to gas. The problem is we're putting in place very large renewable generating capacity without putting in place the additional gas generation we would need to provide the backup. And because we're building renewables without providing adequate backup, far from getting security, we are ensuring very, very severe problems. I believe they're emerging in Germany already. We are destroying our energy security with our green policies.
Mr. Helmer has the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And we've heard that many people in Europe are not very clear in their minds about what social entrepreneurship means. And I'd like to hold up my hand because I've never been very clear about it either. And I have to say that after listening to this debate, I am even more confused. We have had one contributor saying that these social entrepreneurship organisations cannot possibly hope to be competitive, and therefore, at least in government procurement, we should give them favourable consideration, even if they're not competitive. And then again, we've heard that social enterprise groups, obviously, somebody said, are much cheaper to operate and enthuse the participants and are therefore much more competitive. So I'd like to know, is this a sort of process of welfare subsidy and handouts to people who we think are deserving, or is it actually a rather good way of organising economic activity?